Thanks, Gautam. We'll speak for half an hour. I think I'll take around 10-15 minutes, and Rupali takes around another like 10-15 minutes. We'll speak about two of our projects, one called the Gurgaon Glossaries, and the other, which is another glossary called the COVID Glossary. You know, the which is currently being built and stuff like that. And so let me quickly share my screen. Uh, how do I share my screen? Okay. Share share the screen. Okay. So yeah. So can you all see my screen?
No.
Uh,
We were seeing it, Prasad, then it went away.
okay. Uh, can you see my screen now?
Yes, it's back.
Okay. So yeah. So uh, so this is I mean this is a longish project that happened around 8 years ago, 8-9 years ago actually, and it's called Gurgaon Glossaries. Uh, for those of you who do not know about Gurgaon, Gurgaon is a city just outside Delhi. It touches Delhi almost. And Gurgaon is interesting for a variety of reasons and has been kind of described in a variety of ways. Gurgaon is it's said to be the environmental nightmare. It's said to be a complete failure of governance. It is said to be a complete failure of infrastructure and all of those things. So it's and at the same time a kind of a complete a city which is completely governed and managed by corporate capitalism, and these have been the descriptions of Gurgaon largely. And Gurgaon was interesting for us because this project we were invited for again an art show to kind of do some work on Gurgaon, and Gurgaon was always interesting for us for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was, you know, Gurgaon in 2000 was around 100,000 people, and by 2010 it was 2 million people. So in 10 years it kind of gotten almost 2 million people together in one small city. This part of Gurgaon, not the other part of Gurgaon. This particular part of Gurgaon. And we were interested in the question in how did this happen and what happens when a city comes together like this. And Gurgaon is also currently it has the highest per capita GDP in the country, so it's also very rich and stuff like that. So Gurgaon is so our interest was how, trying to look at the mechanics of how this city came together, and when the city settles like this, what happens actually. So and at that time we were formulating that when the city comes together like this, it kind of produces terms, not in words and phrases, but also but in terms of reference. The terms by which it is settling, terms by which the contradictions which are coming together as contradictions in lives and practices, the contradictions kind of not get resolved but figure out a way of existing together. And that's what we called as settling in a city. Settling is not settlement, not resolution, but a way to kind of figure out a way in which contradictions exist with each other. So and those were what we were calling as terms, and the city produces new terms for this settling to happen. Glossary as a project is available online, and it's basically, if I can share this. Can you all see the screen? It's kind of it's there online, and it's a series of 100 terms and photographs and stuff like that. I'll share that. The address, etc. So what we did was we collected 100 terms. I mean, it was three of us working that time, me, Rupali, and another Prasad, Prasad Khanolkar. And we collected these terms, and these terms are interesting because these terms, you can put them in, you can pick up some terms and put them together, and you can and they will produce various constellations, and those constellations can produce conceptual ways of thinking about the city, and just to realize that you add more terms, and that conceptual category kind of completely kind of dismantles itself and becomes something else. So what I'm going to do in this next 10 minutes is kind of talk about three broad ideas which one can put together. You can put together 20 more ideas or 25 more ideas from the terms actually. So yeah. So kind of quickly speak about Gurgaon. Gurgaon is a place, in India. It's a like uh, uh, the Indian rural landscapes are generally large agrarian tracts of land, and then they have these settlements which are really specks in those large agrarian fields. And these are villages which are basically intensely occupied habitations of villagers who own and who work in the land. And Gurgaon was something very very similar. And in late 90s and early 2000s, you know that some very famous developers from Delhi kind of started buying land, and for the first time in India, a call center came up in India, and that was in Gurgaon. And it was basically a land bought from the villagers, and developed into a call center. And before that, uh, the developers were buying land and plotting them and selling them as farmhouses and stuff like that for people who had surplus money in Delhi. So Gurgaon was also had that kind of a brief period. uh, we went to Gurgaon in 2004, 2005 for the first time. And by that time, there were these kind of places. This was one famous street which had huge number of what we call in India as malls. Basically, these are large buildings with numerous small shops of various brands and stuff like that. And along with them, there were villages which had intensified, because what the villagers, after losing their land, they kind of provided housing for the lower level laborers and workers of the city. And city by then already had some front offices, but also headquarters. So today, if you go to Gurgaon, so Google and Intel and Microsoft and Volkswagen, and everybody is there. Everybody has a presence in Gurgaon through large buildings. So there are people who are kind of high level officials for whom large projects are made, but then there is a huge number of people who are kind of who cannot afford those large luxury houses, and they get absorbed in these in the villages. And the villages kind of produce this kind of form, which is basically an old house which is transformed into multi-tenanted small rooms which are rented. This reminded us of the industrial chawls that happened in Bombay, which are very very similar. uh, Industrial housing in Bombay. So this is the luxury apartments where the higher level guys kind of lived, and there are plenty of them like this. 2,000 square feet, 3,000 square feet houses, which are there. And uh, what the developers did at that time was interesting. They did not give money in whole, but what they did was they gave some bit of money, and then the developers gave the landowners some property. So a landowner would have one or two houses in these kind of apartments, and those houses would then be again rented to people who have come from all over the country. These high level officials who are earning in millions actually, uh, 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 who renting these apartments to them. And typically what happens is you when these officials come in and stuff like that, there are these brokers who are there in the villages, and then they kind of get through the broker, and then they find an apartment, and they start living. uh, a contract is made, a paper contract is usually made, and over time, the landlord gets another offer, and or doesn't like the face of the tenant and stuff like that, and then takes 4 or 5 goons to the house and then tries to evict the tenant. And at that time, the tenant only has the phone number of the broker, who's kind of introduced the landlord and the tenant. And then the broker realizes, and the broker takes his own goons and goes, and then there is a huge negotiation that happens, basically ending into some hike in rent. But what is interesting is, most real estate agents of Gurgaon had this kind of martial art academy or some gyms next to them. Basically, this is where they were kind of sourcing their goons from. And we were earlier not able to understand why this kind of combination was occurring. But when the story started flowing in, you kind of got a sense, but also a sense of how the paper contract, basically in number of stories, when paper contract is shown again, that there is a contract between the tenant and the owner, and then the owner just picks up that contract and tears it off and throws it away, and then nobody follows it up with any kind of, because there is no time really, there is no, I mean, it's complicated to do that further. So the glossary is full of these kind of stories and these kind of small stories. But also, like, for example, this one, the it's a new city, and everything needs to be guarded because everything needs to be protected, and everything is private, and there is a whole series of you'll see a series of private security guards who are there in the city in all streets. And there are private detectives agencies, plenty of them in the city also. Along with them, there are these kind of shop owners and these kind of boards. This is, mind you, this is very common now, but this is happening in 2010, 11, when these kind of enterprises, which are basically transferring money from Gurgaon to other places, the banks kind of relying on these kind of agents to transfer money. So they became middlemen to kind of transfer money from one person to another person, for banks. And this is the State Bank of India, really. And the number of keychain makers, implying the mobility of tenants, really. The tenants will go take away the lock and the key, and then you have a new tenant requiring another set of keys. So the streets are full of key and lock repairers and key makers. I mean, I'll go very quickly about the next one. So there are these enclaves which are and people say they live in projects. They don't live in buildings or places or neighborhoods. They live in projects. So and project means, project comes with a house, but also comes with a maid and with a guard and with a plumber and an electrician and all of that. So a house is full of all of those things, and you move from one place to another place depending upon what you can afford and stuff like that. And then there is a whole environmental lobby, which kind of which is happening later, which kind of is into greening and cleaning and stuff like that. And then they have their own kind of ways of expressing themselves in the city. uh, Sometimes the state kind of puts in its efforts into greening, but basically this is a kind of a contract for building these hideous tree guards. But then there are associations, very close to associations in Delhi, but in a very different form. Association of service people who kind of who provide services, because one has to also understand Gurgaon kind of introduces this contract labor. Earlier cities had the lower level labor, the guard and the maid, as more in feudal relationship. You would consider somebody as a part of a family, and somebody who you would know for a long time and stuff like that. And of course, not never a part of family, but you would give some money to them when they are kind of in some crisis and stuff like that, or open a bank account. But the contract labor was completely different, and it was kind of mobile, and it came up, and Gurgaon really very successfully introduced it and kind of settled here. And I think one of the reasons why other cities are not doing very well, because they couldn't handle the contract part of it very well. And of course, this place has an agrarian background, so the number of pest control agencies dealing with lizards and cockroaches and rats, because that's something which is which has a the underground is really handled, occupied by these guys. uh, and then there are these lands which are waiting to be developed, and meanwhile, while they are waiting, they become parking lots and solid waste management, solid waste dumping grounds or debris dumping grounds. I like this slide because of this new way of chilling, and the pigs, in fact. And then there are these landlord shops. I mean, this is a very clear. It doesn't say anything, but very clearly, this is a shop of a landlord who opens the shop. This is basic grocery. Nobody's even scared or bothered or sitting in the shop. But the landlords are kind of playing some cards, and the whole day they sit and play cards basically. So this is another thing that happens on the edges of the villages and the other parts of Gurgaon. And party politics enters largely like this, because of course it's a 2 million people constituency, and this guy was offering uh, rental accommodation for 300 rupees per month, which is around $5 a month. I just like this slide very much. And the last part I want to kind of talk about is a new set of enterprises that have emerged, and of course all kinds of brands are there, servicing these apartments. Of course, the pest control I already spoke about. uh, Security camera and remote cameras, and this is something which we found with plenty of samples. Actually, there this whole idea of people have just entered, they do not trust anybody. The maids come in, or the house help comes in, and then they install a camera, and they're sitting in their office, and throughout the day, periodically they are accessing the camera and looking, and it kind of transcends into a state where you are just kind of curious about how the maid or this house help kind of moves in your house, and doing it for no reason. Actually, it kind of sets up this psychology of the city in very oblique ways. And then there are these, every we were surprised to see these chimneys almost in all buildings that time, and then realized they were basically coming from generators, because the computers and the electricity and all of those things were generated by the building itself. So it's completely decentralized infrastructure in its completely true sense. It generates its own electricity, and it kind of handles its own water and sewerage and stuff like that. But so every building kind of is serviced with many gallons of diesel every morning, and then they and these are the honeysuckers basically. The municipal corporation has 100 of them. Every morning they move around the city, and suck the human shit from the septic tanks from every project. So and plenty of these kind of food services, and a huge number of flats and property services, barbers, and huge number of laborers, and you have these kind of pawn shops, which also doubles up into something else, and somebody who kind of gets some identity cards and tax savers and all kinds of things. uh, So that was Gurgaon glossary. I mean, I was very quick, but I guess you got a sense of it. The glossary then kind of became a form like this in several places, which became, and then it became a form to kind of discuss cities, and we kind of and at various places we were discussing the glossary, and many things came up, and what was interesting is the glossary had these huge number of terms which can be put together, and you can kind of get a sense of the city, but also kind of get into the mechanics of the city, and set up conceptual categories to understand the city, and also kind of project what ways it will move ahead and stuff like that. I will now stop sharing my screen, and Rupali, you will share your screen. Rupali will move into the, the project which came from here. It's COVID glossary. It's kind of it's being done currently. Rupali, you want to continue from
Yeah,
here?
yeah. I just have to find it. Am I not able to see the sorry answer? My, I think I can share screen. Yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, can you see my screen? I just have to
Yeah.
one second. I'll just present it. Yeah, okay. So yeah, so hello everyone, and I think what I'll do is uh, there are two things. One is kind of talking about the idea of the glossary itself. Prasad has already sort of laid it out as a methodology that we were interested in. And this is something that this is more under construction. So unlike the Gurgaon glossaries, it's still being constructed. But I think again, sort of using the idea of the glossary as a method was something that was important to us. Suddenly, like all of us, we felt the crisis that we are all in. And we also got a sense that, none of our institutions, whether it's the state, whether it's the medical institutions or, any of the institutions that sort of that we kind of held by, or we kind of gave us a sense of living our everyday life, somehow were in crisis. And we realized that perhaps it's important to come back and rethink where we are, and we found the glossary then an important method to start looking at the contemporary. And this is again something that we say often, that the contemporary, as Rashti has said, the contemporary is so close to us that it's like watching a cinema with your cheek on the screen, that what all you see is pixels, and you require some form of a distance to be able to see the whole image together. But what if you don't have that distance? If you don't have that distance to see, then perhaps there's another way of doing it, and that is that you have a collective seeing these pixels together, and in some ways talking to each other about their own pixels that they are able to see, and somehow trying to put a picture together of where we are going and what the contemporary is. So I think, so in that sense, the glossary then becomes useful as some a kind of large mammoth quilt that is being stitched together by various people, bringing their own little patches to the table. Um, and the other thing that again Prasad spoke about is this idea that the glossary in some ways is able to put together several constellations of ideas that come together, but in some ways may never be coherent. That the adding of new terms to the glossary also in some ways dismantles some of the earlier terms and earlier ways in which you've been seeing the picture. So in some ways, it also kind of helps you to start looking at the complexities through which the contemporary is being constructed. And in some ways, it also comes from the critique of institutions that we've been sort of located in, and in some ways, institutions with their own sort of memories and their own sort of ways of operating. In some ways, we find sort of congeal themselves around set patterns to kind of reproduce themselves. And in some ways, this kind of congealment, so to say, doesn't allow them to see new patterns, because they often fall into traps, into the binary traps, and because you're constantly having to reproduce yourself through your own frameworks. And so again, this kind of form of the glossary we found as being agile enough to not sort of come together and consolidate like institutions do, but allow you to kind of form new patterns and read new things through. So that's kind of the background of the glossary. And again, like I said, it's under construction. Again, this is being put together by with 200 students at sea. And in some ways, it also began with our own sort of the I mean, in some ways, the field is a very, very important thing for us. When it comes to looking at architecture, looking at urban studies, and like all of us. And we began with the dissertation, the thesis seminar, and we realized that it's difficult to go out, and the field was somehow not available. And so we started kind of looking at the idea of the self as the field, and if the self with its expanded perimeter becomes the field, then what happens when multiple selves come together to construct the field, right? And so in some ways, the glossary became the putting together of multiple selves and their expanded perimeters as the field to kind of think through. Sorry. Okay. So self as the field is one of the terms through which we've been sort of working with or grappling with. But the other thing we realize that there is also the contact with the world, and like we are doing today, we're talking across boundaries. So in some ways, it was the world that was also coming together and huddling together to think through where we are located today. And so series of at sea we had, we realized that this coming together was the coming together of friends from across the world, who were in some ways huddling together to kind of think of where we are. And this is actually a triennial, the Yokohama Triennial, that is curated by the Rux Media Collective. And this was one of they call them episodes in sort of thinking through distributive justice. And this was organized by these three artists, Lantian Cabello and Michelle Wong, for the students of C. And so it was, again, a hour and a half long sort of storytelling session where they walked us through several sites. This was a kind of shuttle in Johannesburg, and series of stories around distributive justice that the three were sort of weaving together and walking the students through. And so in some ways, this idea of the contact with the world and new forms of friendships through which to think together was important. The other interesting thing that happened was, we're a small school. We have 40 students, a batch of 40 students for in 1 year. And so that's 200 students in the whole year, which is, again, a small architecture program. We used to have something called Sea City conversations, where we invited people from all over the, country to kind of participate. And this was, and students projects and discussions were also then opened up to a wider audience. But then now we realized that this was kind of opened up on Zoom, and it was opened up on YouTube. And suddenly you had students dissertation projects being, we had a traffic of some 2,000 people on YouTube, and on Zoom there were like 250 people, 230, I think. And if you see the screenshot and you see this, there are series, several people, but I think this is something that we saw later when we saw the screenshot. Right in the center of this image, there is a gentleman, Kardo Nuruddin Karim. And then, it did a quick Facebook search actually for who he was. And he was a landscape architect and a professor and an assistant professor at a university in Erbil in Iraq, and he was sort of, attending this discussion. And so, in some ways, what was interesting is these kind of cross connections. We used to, in the old days, you had the phone, and suddenly you would have a cross connection from someone else, and you listen to stories from somebody else talking to somebody else. And now there was this possibility of being able to speak to people from across the world, and for students to do this was super interesting. So in some ways, the idea of friendship sort of continued. And then, yeah, the sea city discussion, we had a whole sort of series on South Asia, and sort of people speaking from across the world on South Asia. One again important thing for us in architectural discourse is that the architecture itself was sort of bounded around nationalisms in some ways. This idea of Indianness in architecture became very, very important post independence. And so to say, with other parts of the region. And so in some ways, this idea of blurring of boundaries and starting to think of the region was again a sort of reclamation, and this kind of blurring of narrow parochial boundaries around which architectural discourse was formulated. And yeah, so and then again, new pedagogical tools, the virtual classrooms. But also interestingly, we found that there were new languages that we had to kind of develop to speak through. So in some ways, what was initially a kind of one-to-one desk conversation now became a conversation where you had so many tools that you were grappling with. So there were drawings on screens, and scratches, and scribbles, and zooms and pans, and all kinds of ways in which you you had to kind of develop a new way of talking to each other. And in some ways, it kind of also opened up many more ways, and students were also sort of sending WhatsApp messages across. So the classroom was no longer bounded by space and time, but it became a kind of discursive space across time as well. And then you also kind of realize that you were no longer bound by institutional protocols, and what could be and what could not be said in classrooms. In some ways, it became a kind of extended friendship across. So as you would send WhatsApp messages to friends, you were doing that with students, and it also kind of changed relationships across. So yeah, and then of course people were doing all kinds of things. There was somebody kind of participated in a residency on Instagram, and so these are all terms that students are also then putting together, and ways in which there's somebody who's kind of did a school online. So she was teaching through an NGO that she kind of participated in, and yeah. So I'm just going to go through them, because this is again series of ways in which people have been also grappling with the idea of COVID. And of course, this is the hangman, the whole idea of connectivities and multiple sort of ways in which your connectivities get formed but also fail in many ways. So students are talking about how they had laptops that were duct taped and glued and stitched together, and connections that kind of were made and lost, and series of ways in which, in some ways also, because it's a small school, we also realized people who do not have internet connections, and then the school sort of also extended its own ways in which you could also provide internet connections, year-long scholarships for internet connections. So yeah, and then people who are kind of also talking about how they're at home, suddenly you had laptops kind of becoming the ways in which you connected to the world, and not everybody had them. So the kind of in some ways worked out timings so that they would, people would take breaks and use the same laptop and kind of share it across in the family. So yeah. And then people were talking about new forms of entrepreneurships that were being formed, and these were also many of the students' own families. Again, we also realized in the school that not everybody could pay fees, for example. I mean, a lot of the salaries were cut, and so and these were the stories that were coming in from the families itself, that in some ways many of them started getting into new businesses, started selling, also selling health equipment, because now that was the only kind of window that was open to make money. And then there was the student who was kind of looking at the lockdown had closed down many avenues for people. So there were the new kind of configurations where people had started renting a small chawl houses near markets, and so that whenever there was a little window of being opening up markets, they would be staying close to the market. So again, new configurations of renting around markets that happened, and again, these were through their own sort of networks. So yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to go through them because these are again stories, new forms of entrepreneurships, vending shops becoming vending machines, and balconies becoming spaces to transact goods, and again, new forms of connections being made. The side open spaces of apartment complexes becoming markets. So the markets were now coming to people's homes. You had urban clap networks, older people. There was these services where people would come home to give haircuts. E-tailing, new forms of e-tailing that kind of took place. Yeah, I mean, this is a student who suddenly, his family is kind of entrepreneurial, so he sort of dons a PP kit and goes around in his car, which is almost like a spaceship for him, and he's kind of and provides masks and other health equipment, but also faces this kind of, when he comes back to his society or his building, he kind of faces discrimination in many ways there. So he kind of writes about that. So yeah. And then again, other forms of crisis, old age, but new forms of solidarities. So, what happens with it? You had, this is somebody who takes calls, gets her older cousin who lives alone home and starts kind of forming new networks. Forms of solidarities, again, an intergenerational, intra-generational friendships being formed. An older person living alone at home starts, inviting her younger friend over to kind of help her set up her house. Yeah, and then series of stories around home and housing. And so I'm just going to go through it. New forms of cellularization that are happening, people. And this is again something that you find that people in Mumbai have very, very small houses. So what happened, all kinds of power relationships that get formed, people kind of claiming their own spaces in the house, and all kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, these were again stories and changes in behavior, who does what in the home. Yeah, so I'm just going to go through these because I think we'll get a sense of things. Yeah, I mean, lots and lots of kind of completely rethinking the idea of the home. This is somebody who's kind of, there's a bridge home so these are migrants who come from a neighboring village, but this is again people who come every year to this place and go back. So it's a kind of seasonal migration that happens, but this is again something that has continued to happen in COVID times. So yeah, I mean, a series of stories, like the safety door was a barrier that kind of, that kept thieves away, but suddenly now it becomes a barrier where people are kind of talking across safety doors. So this is a society that kind of has set down rules for how people can come together, and they can actually come together, but they have to be across safety doors in the apartment. So yeah, I mean, ideas of loneliness and coming together, and also the students who are kind of this student who kind of has shifted completely. Her entire family is shifted to a second home, which is outside Mumbai, and that has become now her new home. Stories of migrants and spaces that are, this is again a student's house uh, in a site and services scheme in Mumbai. But also kind of because people started losing jobs, they kind of also found new ways. They started extending their own houses, setting up places where people could sell things, masks and bags that they made. So these became kind of extensions to their own houses. Um, yeah, all forms of entrepreneurship that kind of opened up. So yeah, and of course new forms of obsessions and occupation of time. And so I'm going to just run through this and maybe just come, yeah.
Rupali, we'll begin to wrap in for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Close up.
So I'm just going to, that's what I just coming to the end of this, and maybe, yeah. Yeah, I mean, just new forms of assemblies and, that are taking place. Yeah, like terraces starting to get used as places where people would come together, and yeah. So and of course neighborhood as home, because that's the ways in which people are kind of extending themselves. The idea of the outside becoming a kind of unsafe space with the lockdown is something that that was sort of shouted out, or across television screens. But in many ways we start seeing that people actually start reversing that. The neighborhood becomes home, and there are many ways in which people sort of inhabit this. So neighborhood fairs and all kinds of things kind of taking place. So yeah, I'll end.